Therefore, due to your recent conduct, we find it necessary to terminate your employment effective immediately. You will...
A third arrangement is required, Miss Davies. 3 hours before the dinner.
The morning they fired her, she did not cry. She had worked in that house for 3 years. 3 winters. 3 harvest seasons. 3 Christmas preparations that she had organized from the linen closet to the last candle on the last table. And when the housekeeper read the dismissal notice aloud in the servants' hall with 11 staff members watching, Clara Marsh stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level and her eyes completely dry. Because crying required the belief that something unjust had happened. And what had happened was not unjust. It was simply the logical outcome of a world organized by people who had decided that a woman who spoke the truth was more dangerous than the lie she had spoken it against. She had told the truth. She had been fired for it. Those were facts. Facts did not require tears. What she did not know, what none of them knew, not the housekeeper reading the notice with careful satisfaction, not the 11 watching servants with their careful faces, not Lord Harley whose complaint had produced the notice in the first place, was that someone else had been in the corridor outside the servants' hall when the truth was spoken. Someone who had heard every word. Someone who had said nothing at the time. Who had returned to his study and sat for 40 minutes with the specific stillness of a man who has heard something that requires decisions he is not yet ready to make. And who, 3 days later, sent a letter to an address he had obtained through means Lord Harley would have found extremely uncomfortable. The letter contained 2 things. A formal offer of employment. And a question she had not been asked in 3 years of service. What is your area of expertise? Welcome to Regent Hearts. This is the story of the maid who was fired for speaking back. And the Duke who hired her personally. Subscribe before we go further. Hit the bell. Now let us begin. Clara Marsh had been speaking back since she was 9 years old. Not from stubbornness. Not from the specific recklessness of a child who has not yet learned the cost of honesty. From a quality her mother had described, with the particular combination of pride and exhaustion that characterizes the parent of an honest child, as an inability to let wrong things stand uncorrected. At 9 she had corrected her schoolmaster's arithmetic in front of 30 children. The schoolmaster had been wrong. The correction had been accurate. The consequence had been swift. At 14 she had told the draper on the high street that the wool he was selling as merino was clearly a lesser grade. The draper had been affronted. She had been correct. Her mother had quietly purchased their wool elsewhere for the following 4 years. At 17, when her father died and the family's modest financial situation became a practical crisis, she had taken a position in service with the specific focused discipline of someone who understands that survival requires managing one's most inconvenient qualities. She had been a good servant. She had learned quickly. She had understood the hierarchy and its requirements and had navigated them with the care of someone walking a path with significant drops on either side. For 6 years she had been very careful. Then she had come to Ashworth House. The Ashworth estate occupied 4,000 acres of the most productive agricultural land in the county. The house itself was a significant building, 3 centuries of accumulated wealth in grey stone and tall windows, with a library that contained 1,700 volumes and a kitchen garden that could have fed a small village. The staff was large. The protocols were established. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pendleton, ran the domestic operation with the efficient precision of a woman who had been doing it for 22 years and had arrived at the specific management philosophy of someone who believes that the primary purpose of household staff is invisibility. Clara had been invisible for 3 years. She had been very good at it. Right up until the morning of the Ashworth winter dinner. The winter dinner was the largest social event of the Ashworth calendar, 34 guests, 7 courses, 3 weeks of preparation, and the specific atmospheric pressure of an occasion that Lord Harley, the Duke's cousin who managed the estate in the Duke's absence, had described to Mrs. Pendleton as the most important evening of the year and then proceeded to involve himself in every detail of its preparation in ways that were consistently and specifically unhelpful. Lord Harley had decided, for days before the dinner, that the dining room table arrangement was incorrect. He had communicated this to Mrs. Pendleton. Mrs. Pendleton had communicated it to Clara, who had been assigned to the table preparation. Clara had rearranged the table. Lord Harley had then decided, 2 days before the dinner, that the original arrangement had in fact been correct. Clara had rearranged the table back. Lord Harley had then decided, the morning of the dinner, that a third arrangement entirely was required and had communicated this to Clara.
A third arrangement is required, Miss Davies. 3 hours before the dinner.
Directly, in the dining room, with 3 hours until the first guests arrived. Clara had looked at the table she had arranged and rearranged 4 times in 4 days. She had looked at the 47 items of cutlery and crystal and linen required per setting. She had looked at Lord Harley. And something that had been very carefully managed for 3 years had, for a period of approximately 90 seconds, become somewhat less carefully managed. What she said was not a dramatic speech. It was not a declaration or a confrontation or an act of deliberate rebellion. It was a specific, clearly articulated explanation of why the current table arrangement was superior to Lord Harley's proposed third arrangement, delivered in the calm precise tone she used for everything, including the information that the explanation should have taken approximately 45 seconds to process and act upon given that the dinner was in 3 hours. Lord Harley had not processed it in 45 seconds. Lord Harley had processed it as an insult. He had gone to Mrs. Pendleton. Mrs. Pendleton had written the notice. The notice was read in the servants' hall the following morning. Clara collected her things. She left. She did not cry. What she did not know was that the Duke of Ashworth had arrived home the previous evening. 3 weeks early. Without announcement. In the way that men who are accustomed to managing significant properties sometimes return to them, without fanfare, through the east entrance, with a single traveling bag and the specific quiet intention of a man who wants to understand what his estate actually looks like when it is not being prepared for his arrival. He had been in the corridor outside the servants' hall. He had heard everything. His name was Edward Ashworth. 38 years old. Duke of Ashworth. The fourth in the line since the title was created, the second to have any genuine interest in the estate's agricultural operations, and the first in the family history to have spent significant time in the field rather than the drawing room, which had produced, over the course of 15 years of estate management, a man whose understanding of how large properties actually worked was considerably more detailed than his position would have strictly required. He had inherited the dukedom at 23 when his father died of a fever that moved faster than anyone expected. He had inherited, along with the title and the 4,000 acres and the house with the 1,700-volume library, a management structure that had been accumulating inefficiencies for a generation. His father had been a charming man with a genuine talent for spending money and a genuine disinclination to track where it went. Edward had spent 15 years correcting this. He was not a man who tolerated wasted capacity. In people or in agricultural land. Which was why he had been standing very still in the corridor outside the servants' hall listening to a maid explain, with startling precision, the specific spatial and logistical reasons why the current table arrangement would produce a superior dining experience for 34 guests, and why Lord Harley's proposed third modification would create a circulation problem at the east end of the table that would affect service timing for the 4th through 7th courses. She had been absolutely correct. He had checked the table himself that evening after the dinner concluded. The arrangement had functioned exactly as she had described. The circulation at the east end had been smooth. The service had been precisely timed. He had also checked Lord Harley's proposed modification on paper and confirmed that it would, in fact, have created the exact problem she identified. He had then gone to his study and sat for 40 minutes. Not because he was uncertain about what he thought. Because what he thought had implications he needed to consider carefully. A member of his household staff had been dismissed for being correct. For providing accurate information that was rejected because the person who received it was unwilling to be corrected. The dismissal had been carried out efficiently and quietly, which was how these things were always carried out, and in the normal course of events it would have remained entirely invisible to him because the normal course of events did not involve the Duke arriving home 3 weeks early through the east entrance. But he had arrived home 3 weeks early through the east entrance. And he had heard. He spent the following morning reviewing Mrs. Pendleton's household records, a review he conducted every 6 months as a matter of practice, the specific practice of a man who had learned from his father's example that things not examined regularly produced expensive surprises. The records were thorough. Mrs. Pendleton was an excellent housekeeper in the ways that mattered for maintaining a large household. The staff she retained were reliable. The operations were smooth. The accounts were accurate. But there was something in the staff records he had not previously noticed. Staff turnover. Not excessive. Not alarming. But consistent, across 3 years, in a specific category. The staff who left most frequently were not the ones who were incapable. They were the ones who were capable. Promotion, in several cases. The kitchen assistant who had gone on to a cook's position elsewhere. The footman who had moved to a larger household. The gardener's assistant who had taken a head gardener position. In each case, someone capable had developed their capability in his household and then been unable to advance within it because the positions above them were occupied by long-tenured staff with no interest in vacating. And in one case, in the records from 3 days ago, a maid of the first rank who had been dismissed for insubordination following a disagreement with Lord Harley about a table arrangement. He had read that record twice. Insubordination. He looked at the word for a long time. Then he went to find Lord Harley. The conversation that followed was not the kind that appeared in household records. It was brief. It was specific. It was conducted in the East Wing study with the door closed. Lord Harley left the conversation looking as though he had been presented with information he had not expected and would have preferred not to receive. He departed for London the following morning. Edward returned to his study. He opened a fresh sheet of correspondence paper. He wrote a letter. The letter required 4 drafts, not because the content was uncertain but because the framing required precision. He was writing to a woman who had been dismissed from his household under circumstances that he was now responsible for, and he was offering her employment under circumstances that required explaining clearly enough that the offer would not be misread as anything other than what it was. He knew, from the household records, what her name was. He did not know what her area of expertise was, beyond the specific combination of spatial reasoning, logistical precision, and willingness to speak accurate information in uncomfortable situations that he had witnessed in the corridor. He asked. The letter was dispatched. He returned to the estate accounts. He also made a note in the margin of his management review, under the heading Structural Gaps, that the Ashworth household advancement protocols required revision. He underlined it twice. Clara was staying with her aunt in the village when the letter arrived. Her aunt was a practical woman who had received her niece's arrival with the specific resigned warmth of someone who had expected this eventually and had set aside a room accordingly. The room was small and cold and contained a narrow bed and a window overlooking the back garden, which was bare in the January frost. Clara found it entirely adequate. She was not in crisis. She had £3 saved, which was enough for 2 months if she was careful, and she had references from 2 previous positions that were genuine and specific and would support applications to other households. She had spent the first day cataloguing her options. She had spent the second day writing 3 letters of application. She had spent the third day with her aunt's mending basket, which was overflowing in a way that suggested it had not been addressed in some time. The letter arrived on the 4th day. She recognized the Ashworth seal immediately. She held the letter for a moment before opening it. Whatever it contained, it was not a letter she had expected to receive. She opened it. She read it. Then she read it again. The letter was from the Duke of Ashworth. Not through Mrs. Pendleton. Not through the household secretary. From the Duke directly, in handwriting that was precise and legible and contained no flourishes, which told her something about the man before the content told her anything at all. It acknowledged, without excessive language, that the circumstances of her dismissal had come to his attention and that he had reviewed the relevant facts and found the outcome inappropriate. It acknowledged that what had occurred was not within his knowledge at the time it occurred and was now within his knowledge, and that these two facts had different implications. It offered her a position. Not her previous position. A new one. The title was Household Operations Manager, a title that did not currently exist in the Ashworth staff structure and that the letter acknowledged was being created specifically for this offer. The responsibilities described were the kind that had previously been distributed across 3 different roles with insufficient coordination: the management of the household's operational efficiency, including staff scheduling, supply chain management, event coordination, and the specific category the letter called administrative oversight of all household functions affecting the estate's productive capacity. It was, in practical terms, the position of running a significant country estate's domestic operations with genuine authority rather than the performed authority of a senior maid correcting a table arrangement at personal cost. And then there was the question. What is your area of expertise? She set the letter down. She looked at the frost on the back garden window. She thought about 3 years of careful invisibility. She thought about the dining room table. She thought about the specific quality of a question that was genuinely asking rather than performing interest. She picked up her pen. She wrote back. The reply was 4 sentences. My area of expertise is operational efficiency in large domestic establishments. I am specifically capable in supply management, staff coordination, event logistics, and the identification of structural inefficiencies in household management systems. I accept the position as described. I will arrive on Monday. She dispatched the reply. She informed her aunt. She spent the weekend reviewing everything she knew about the Ashworth estate's operational structure, which was considerable, because 3 years of working in a place taught you its architecture whether or not you had ever been given the authority to address its problems. By Sunday evening she had a list. 11 items. Each one a structural inefficiency she had observed and been unable to address. Each one with a proposed solution. She packed the list with her things. Monday morning she took the carriage to Ashworth House. Part 4, the first week. Mrs. Pendleton received her in the entrance hall with the expression of a woman who has been informed of a decision she did not make and has decided that the appropriate response is the specific careful neutrality of someone managing their reaction in a professional context. Clara received this with the specific careful neutrality of someone who understands exactly what is happening and has decided that the appropriate response is to make the neutrality unnecessary as quickly as possible by being so comprehensively useful that objection becomes impractical. They understood each other perfectly. The Duke was in the North Field when she arrived, which she learned from the butler, who had the air of a man who had been informed of the new appointment and had formed no particular opinion of it and was waiting to see what the evidence produced. Clara found this more manageable than enthusiasm. She was shown to her office. It was a real office, a room, not a corner of a room. A desk. A filing cabinet. A window overlooking the kitchen garden. Small. Adequate. The window was the best feature. She could see the vegetable rows from it, which told her things about the kitchen garden's management that she found immediately useful. She sat down. She opened the filing cabinet. She began reading. By noon she had read 3 years of household operational records. By 3 in the afternoon she had cross-referenced them with the supply ledgers and the staff schedules. By 5 she had revised the list from 11 items to 17. She was on item 14 when the door opened. The Duke. She had seen him once before, briefly, in the corridor outside the servants' hall 3 weeks ago, when he had been returning through the east entrance and she had been making her way to the linen cupboard and they had passed within 10 feet of each other without speaking. She had not known then who he was. She knew now. He was taller than she had registered in the corridor. Dark-coated from the North Field, with the specific look of a man who had been outside in January and had found it less uncomfortable than many men would have found it. The handwriting had been accurate, no flourishes. The face matched. He looked at the desk. At the files she had organized. At the list she was writing. He did not comment on the fact that she had been there for 7 hours and had apparently spent the entire time reading records and making lists. Instead he said one word. 17. She understood immediately that he had been watching long enough to count the items. She said, "The first 11 are operational inefficiencies currently costing the estate an estimated £40 per quarter in unnecessary expenditure and 17 hours of staff time per week. The remaining 6 are structural gaps in the coordination between the household operations and the estate agricultural schedule that are producing recurring friction. I have proposed solutions for all 17. He sat down in the chair across from her desk. He said, "Show me." She showed him. Not summarized. Not managed for palatability. The full detail of each item, the evidence, the cost, the proposed solution, and the projected outcome. He listened with the complete focused attention of a man who was genuinely following rather than performing comprehension. He asked 4 questions. All 4 were good questions. The kind that refined rather than challenged, that identified where her analysis required more precision rather than where it might be wrong. She answered all 4. He approved 13 of the 17 proposals immediately. 3 he deferred, not because they were wrong but because they intersected with decisions about the estate's agricultural operations that required information she did not yet have. 1 he rejected, with reasoning she examined for 30 seconds and found sound. She amended the list. He stood. He said, "I will need to understand your filing system." She said, "I will document it. The organizational logic is consequence-based rather than chronological. Everything is filed by impact on operational efficiency rather than by date." He said, "I've been receiving chronological files for 15 years. She said, "Chronological filing tells you what happened. Consequence filing tells you what matters." He looked at the cabinet. He said, "Start with the supply management. The quarterly overspend has been in the records for 3 years." She said, "I found it in the first hour. The primary cause is a vendor arrangement that was negotiated in 1847 and has not been reviewed since. The market rate for the relevant goods has changed considerably." He said, "How much?" She said, "Approximately £60 per year at current terms versus market rate." He said, "And nobody identified this." She said, "Nobody was assigned to identify it." The distinction landed in the room. He looked at her. She looked back. He said, "Monday morning. Supply management." She said, "I will have the revised vendor analysis ready." He left. She returned to item 14. January at Ashworth House changed. Not dramatically. Not in ways that were visible in a single day. In the specific gradual way of a household that has been running at 70% of its capacity, discovering what 80% feels like and then what 90% feels like. The supply management review was complete by the end of the first week. 3 vendor contracts were renegotiated. The savings were exactly what she had projected. The staff scheduling revision was implemented in the second week. The friction between the kitchen schedule and the cleaning schedule, which had been producing a specific recurring conflict every Tuesday and Thursday that everyone had adapted to rather than resolved, disappeared. The event coordination protocol she established in the third week reduced the preparation time for the monthly estate dinner by 4 hours without reducing the quality of the outcome. Mrs. Pendleton watched all of this. Not with hostility. Something more complicated. The expression of a woman who has been excellent at a job for 22 years and is watching a structural analysis of that job reveal things she had not seen and is processing the specific complex emotion of simultaneously respecting the analysis and finding it uncomfortable to receive. Clara understood this. She made a point of consulting Mrs. Pendleton on everything that touched the household's existing protocols before changing them. Not because she needed the input, she usually had the analysis complete before the consultation. But because the consultation itself produced something more valuable than any single operational improvement. It produced the specific quality of information that only came from 22 years of actually doing something. Mrs. Pendleton knew things about the Ashworth household that were not in any record. Things about how the estate's rhythms worked, which vendors were reliable in which seasons, which staff members needed managing in which ways, which of the Duke's preferences were stated and which were simply known. By the end of the third week something had shifted between them. It was not warmth exactly. It was the specific professional respect of two people who have discovered that their different areas of knowledge are more complementary than competitive. Mrs. Pendleton began appearing at Clara's office door on Tuesday afternoons. She did not call these visits anything. She simply arrived with tea and observations. Clara did not call them anything either. She simply listened, and made notes, and occasionally the Tuesday afternoon observations appeared in the analysis she provided to the Duke on Wednesday mornings. The Wednesday morning meetings had become a fixed point in the week. Clara came with the operations report. The Duke came with the questions the report produced. They worked through it systematically. He approved or deferred or asked for more detail. She amended or clarified or produced additional analysis. By the fourth Wednesday she had stopped preparing the operations report with the careful formality of a new employee demonstrating their value and had started producing it with the specific direct clarity of someone whose value had been established and who was now focused on the actual problems. He noticed the change. He said nothing about it. He asked better questions. It was the Northfield drainage report that changed things. Not between them specifically. In the estate. But what happened with the estate changed what was between them, in the specific way that shared work changes relationships between people who are both actually working. The Northfield drainage problem had been in the estate records for 4 years. Clara had found it in her first week reading, a recurring expenditure item, a series of repair costs that appeared quarterly with the specific regularity of a problem that was being addressed symptomatically without being resolved. She had flagged it in her original 17-item list under the category of structural gaps between household operations and estate agricultural management. She had looked at it from the operational side, the supply costs, the labor hours, the scheduling impact. The Duke had been looking at it from the agricultural side, the yield impacts, the soil conditions, the drainage infrastructure. On a Wednesday morning in the 5th week she brought both analyses to the meeting. She spread them on the desk beside each other. He looked at them. She looked at them. They were the same problem described from 2 different positions, and together they produced a complete picture that neither had been able to see from their individual position. She said nothing. He said nothing. They both looked at the combined analysis for a long moment. Then he stood up and said, "Northfield. Now." She was already putting on her coat. They walked the Northfield together in the January cold with both sets of notes in her hands and the specific practical conversation of 2 people who are solving a problem rather than discussing the problem's implications for their relationship with each other. He knew the field's agricultural character in ways she had not encountered in any record. He could describe the subsurface drainage behavior across seasons from direct observation. He could point to specific areas where the drainage failure manifested and explain what they looked like after heavy rain. She had the operational data, the timing of the failure cycles, the cost patterns, the relationship between the drainage problem and specific staff deployment decisions that had been producing their own inefficiencies. Together they identified the cause in 40 minutes. A drainage channel that had been installed incorrectly in the previous estate manager's tenure, too shallow in the northern section, directing water toward the problem area rather than away from it. The solution required redirecting the channel. 2 days of work by the estate's maintenance team. Materials cost of approximately £30. Projected saving of £200 per year in repair costs and yield losses. She wrote it up in the carriage on the way back. He reviewed it before they reached the house. He signed the work order on the front steps. The maintenance team began the following morning. That was the 5th week. By the 6th week something else had shifted. She noticed it first in the Wednesday meetings. He was arriving earlier. Not dramatically, 5 minutes, then 10. But consistently. He was also staying later. The meetings that had been 1 hour were becoming 90 minutes. Not because the agenda was longer. Because the conversation was. She noticed it secondly in the way he walked through the house. He had always been a man who moved through his own household with the specific casual authority of someone who knows a space well. But she began to notice him pausing near her office. Not entering. Pausing. In the way a man pauses near something he is considering rather than near something that simply happened to be in his path. She filed this in the category she had labeled, with the specific honest precision she applied to all significant matters, personal implications, requires careful management. She managed it carefully. She focused on the North Field drainage follow-up. She focused on the vendor contracts. She focused on the estate spring planning schedule, which needed to be built by the end of February and which required coordination between the agricultural operations and the household supply chain in ways that had never previously been formally managed. She was 3 weeks into the spring planning schedule when Lord Harley returned. He arrived without announcement on a Thursday afternoon. Clara was in the supply storage reviewing the inventory against the spring planning schedule when she heard the carriage. She went to the window. She saw the Harley crest on the door. She returned to the inventory. Lord Harley's presence in Ashworth House was audible from several rooms away. He had the specific quality of a man who communicated his position through volume and the confident assumption that every room he entered was improved by his arrival. Clara had spent 3 years understanding his management style, which could be summarized as the conviction that authority required no justification and that the function of staff was to implement his decisions without the tedious intermediate step of evaluating whether those decisions were correct. She heard him making his way toward the Duke's study. She heard the study door open. She returned to the inventory. 2 hours later Mrs. Pendleton appeared at her office door. Her expression was the specific carefully neutral expression she deployed when she had information that required transmission without commentary. She said, "Lord Harley is suggesting the spring dinner arrangements be placed under his supervision." Clara looked up from the spring planning schedule. She said, "The spring planning schedule is already 40% complete." Mrs. Pendleton said, "Yes." She said, "The vendor contracts for the spring menu have been finalized based on the revised supply chain framework." Mrs. Pendleton said, "Yes." She said, "The staff rotation for the event has been built into the April scheduling." Mrs. Pendleton said, "Yes." They looked at each other. Clara said, "I will finish the current section of the planning document and have it on the Duke's desk by tomorrow morning with a full status report." Mrs. Pendleton said, "That seems wise." She returned to the spring planning schedule. She worked until 11 that evening. The document on the Duke's desk the following morning was comprehensive. 41 pages. The complete status of the spring planning, the current vendor arrangements, the staff schedule, the projected costs, the coordination timeline. A cover page that summarized the current state in one paragraph. She had not written a cover page arguing against Lord Harley. She had written a cover page describing the state of the work. The state of the work was the argument. By noon the spring dinner arrangements had not been transferred. By the following day Lord Harley had departed for London. She did not know what had been said. She did not need to know. The work was the evidence. The evidence had been sufficient. February brought the specific quality of late winter light that arrived on clear mornings with a warmth that was more promise than reality but that made the Ashworth estate look like something that would be extraordinary in 3 months when the light delivered on the promise. She was in the North Field on a February morning, checking the drainage channel work against the projected performance metrics, when she heard footsteps behind her. She knew from the pace that it was the Duke. He came to stand beside her at the channel. They both looked at the water moving correctly. She said, "The secondary flow rate is tracking above projection. The channel redirection exceeded the minimum performance threshold in the first frost cycle." He said, "I know. I checked the readings this morning." A pause. She said, "The spring yield projections for the North Field have been revised upward. I put the revised figures in the Thursday operations report." He said, "I read them." Another pause. The February light moved across the field. He said, "You documented the filing system." She said, "Yes. I left the documentation on your desk last Tuesday." He said, "I read it." She said, "It is consequence-based rather than chronological. Everything is organized by." He said, "Impact on operational efficiency." "I know. I spent 2 hours with it on Tuesday evening." She looked at him. He was looking at the north field. He said, "You were right about the table arrangement." The non sequitur was not a non sequitur. She understood what it was immediately. She said, "Yes. I was." He said, "And about the vendor contracts. And the staff scheduling. And the drainage channel. And the spring planning." She said, "Yes." He said, "And about 17 other things I have been doing wrong for 3 years." She said, "You were not doing them wrong. You were doing them without the analysis that would have shown how they could be done better. Those are different things." He turned and looked at her. The specific expression she had been noticing in the Wednesday meetings for 3 weeks was present in full. Not managed. Not constructed. The expression of a man who has been paying attention for 2 months and has arrived at a conclusion he has been testing and retesting and is now certain of. He said, "You would have been gone." She said, "Yes." He said, "If I had arrived 1 day later." She said, "Yes." He said, "If I had come through the main entrance instead of the east." She said, "Yes." He said, "If Harley had never asked about the table." She said, "Yes." He said, "That is an unacceptable number of contingencies." She said, "Most significant things depend on contingencies. The drainage channel has been wrong for 4 years. You needed someone to look at both sets of data simultaneously." He said, "I needed you specifically." The north field was very quiet. The water moved correctly in the channel. She said, "That is a different statement from the others." He said, "I know. I have been trying to make it for approximately 3 weeks and the correct framing has been eluding me." She said, "And now?" He said, "And now I am standing in a field in February because I have found that thinking near this field produces more clarity than thinking anywhere else, which I am certain is related to the drainage solution and the specific quality of problem solving that produced it." She looked at the channel. She said, "Operational efficiency has a quality of satisfaction that is difficult to replicate." He said, "I am not talking about the drainage channel." She looked at him. He looked back. He said, "I sent you a letter with a question. You answered it in 4 sentences. You said your expertise was operational efficiency. You said you would arrive on Monday. You arrived on Monday. You produced 17 items in 8 hours and have been solving them systematically ever since." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to ask you another question." She said, "Ask it." He said, "Is there anything in the Ashworth operation structure that you cannot improve?" She said, "The East Wing drainage is going to need attention in approximately 18 months. I have flagged it in the long-term maintenance schedule." He said, "That is not what I asked." She said, "I know what you asked." He said, "Answer it." She looked at the north field. At the water moving correctly. At the February light on the frost-touched grass. She said, "The human relationships in this household are not in my operational brief." He said, "I am revising your brief." She said, "That is a significant revision." He said, "Yes." She said, "It requires discussion." He said, "I know." She said, "Specific discussion. Not implied discussion. The kind that produces clarity rather than assumptions." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then we should have it." He said, "Yes." Neither moved immediately. The channel ran. The light moved. She said, "The spring planning schedule is due to be completed by the end of the month." He said, "I know." She said, "I have 6 sections remaining." He said, yes. She said, the specific discussion should happen after the spring planning schedule is complete. He said, why? She said, because the spring planning schedule is a finite deliverable with a clear endpoint and the specific discussion is not a finite deliverable and I prefer to finish things in the correct order. He almost smiled. She said, that is a reasonable response. He said, I know. He said, the spring planning schedule. End of the month. She said, yes. He said, and then. She said, and then the specific discussion. He said, yes. They walked back to the house together. Not side by side immediately. And then, because the path was narrow and the frost had made the edges uncertain, side by side. The distance between them, the specific manageable distance of two people who have agreed on a timeline and are keeping it. She finished the spring planning schedule on the 28th. It was complete at 9 in the evening. She placed it on the Duke's desk. It was 47 pages. Comprehensive. Every vendor confirmed. Every staff schedule built. Every coordination point documented. The entire operational architecture of the Ashworth spring season organized with the consequence-based logic she had brought to everything. She returned to her office. She sat for a moment. The office was dark except for the lamp. The kitchen garden was dark outside the window. She thought about the 11 items she had arrived with in January. She thought about 17. She thought about 47 pages of spring planning. She thought about the Northfield Channel. She thought about Mrs. Pendleton's Tuesday afternoon visits and what they had produced. She thought about Lord Harley's departure and what the 41-page status report had communicated without stating. She thought about the Northfield in February. About the specific discussion. She turned off the lamp. She walked to the study. The door was not fully closed. Light from inside. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She came in. He was at the desk. The spring planning schedule was open in front of him. He had been reading it. She said, "The spring planning schedule is complete." He said, "Yes. I have been reading it." She said, "It is 47 pages." He said, "I know. I am on page 31. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. She said, "The specific discussion." He closed the spring planning schedule. He looked at her. He said, "The maid who was fired for speaking back." She said, "Yes." He said, "Who I hired personally." She said, "Yes." He said, "And who has been running this estate's operations with a precision that has saved approximately £300 in the first 2 months and will save considerably more over the course of a year." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like the record corrected." She said, "Which part?" He said, "The dismissal record. Insubordination. I want it corrected." She said, "What is the correct description?" He said, "Speaking the truth accurately in a difficult situation at personal cost." A pause. She said, "That is a more accurate description." He said, "Yes." He said, "And the current position description?" She said, "Household Operations Manager." He said, "I would like to revise that as well." She said, "To what?" He stood up. He came around the desk. He sat in the other chair, the chair beside her rather than across from her. The specific geometry of beside rather than across. He said, "I have been revising it for 3 weeks." She said, "And?" He said, "I cannot find a title that is accurate for what you actually are to this estate and this house and," he stopped. She said, "And?" He said, "And to me." The study was very quiet. The fire was low and warm. He said, "There is a position that does not yet exist in the Ashworth household structure." She said, "You create positions when you find them necessary." He said, "Yes." He said, "The position is yours if you want it." She said, what is the title? He said, I was hoping you would suggest one. She looked at him. The expression she had been managing since the North Field in February was simply present. She said, The Lady of Ashworth. He said, yes. She said, that is a significant change from household operations manager. He said, yes. She said, it requires a specific discussion of its own. He said, we are having it. She said, a longer one. He said, yes. We have time. She said, the East Wing drainage in 18 months. He said, yes. She said, the 5-year agricultural rotation review. He said, yes. She said, the library reorganization. 1,700 volumes by subject rather than acquisition date produces a 70% improvement in reference efficiency. He said, I know. You put it in the operational notes in week 3. She said, those are commitments. He said, I know what they are. She said, I am not a contingency. He said, no. She said, I am not a convenient arrangement. He said, no. She said, I am the person who found the drainage problem and fixed the vendor contracts and built 47 pages of spring planning and reorganized the filing system and brought Mrs. Pendleton to Tuesday afternoon consultations and stayed until 11 in the evening to make sure the work was sufficient evidence on its own. He said, I know who you are. She said, say it specifically. He said, you are the most capable person who has ever worked in this house. You are the person who corrected a table arrangement correctly in a corridor and was dismissed for it and who arrived on Monday as you said you would and produced 17 items in 8 hours and has not stopped since. You are the person I have been arriving at Wednesday meetings 10 minutes early to see and staying 90 minutes late because the conversation is better than any conversation I have had in years. You are the person I want to have the specific discussion with about the East Wing drainage and the library reorganization and everything else on the list and every list that comes after it for however long you are willing to produce lists. She looked at him. He looked back. She said, that is a specific statement. He said, you required specificity. She said, yes. He said, Clara. She said, yes. He said, ask me properly. She said, that is my line. He said, I know. I have been preparing to say it since February. A pause. She said, ask me properly. He said, will you stay? Not as the operations manager. Not as the person who corrects my filing system. As the Lady of Ashworth. Specifically. With all the requirements that produces. Including the specific discussions about the East Wing drainage and the library reorganization and the 1,700 volumes and every Tuesday afternoon and every Wednesday morning and every February Northfield conversation for however long this estate stands. She looked at the study. At the spring planning schedule on his desk. At the filing cabinet where the consequence-based system was documented and labeled and organized for anyone to understand. At the window where the Ashworth grounds were dark and the February cold was pressing against the glass. At him. She said, yes. He said, yes to the position or yes to everything. She said, yes to everything. Those were never actually separable. The study was very quiet. Then she said, the spring planning schedule. Page 31. He said, yes. She said, the vendor confirmation for the April dinner is on page 32. You should read it before Monday. He said, I will read it tonight. She said, good. She stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped. She turned back. She said, the filing system documentation. He said, I read it. She said, all of it. He said, Tuesday evening. 2 hours. She said, the consequence-based logic requires understanding the difference between what happened and what matters. He said, I understand the difference. She said, I know. She left. He picked up the spring planning schedule. He turned to page 32. Outside, the Ashworth estate was dark and cold and entirely, precisely, working correctly. The north field channel ran. The kitchen garden was laid for spring. The vendor contracts were signed. The staff schedule was built. The files were organized by consequence. The Lady of Ashworth was in her office finishing the East Wing drainage preliminary assessment. And the Duke of Ashworth was reading page 32 of the spring planning schedule with the expression of a man who has understood, completely and finally, the difference between what happened and what matters. What happened was, a maid was fired for speaking back. What matters was, she never stopped.
Before you go. Clara Marsh was dismissed from her position for telling the truth accurately at personal cost. She was not dramatic about it. She collected her things. She left. She did not cry. And 3 days later a letter arrived from a man who had been in the corridor and had heard everything and had spent 40 minutes in his study deciding what to do about what he had heard. He had not sent the letter because she was convenient. He had not sent the letter because he needed a household manager. He sent it because he had watched an entire system dismiss the most capable person in the room for the specific crime of being correct, and he found that failure intolerable. Insubordination, the record said. Speaking the truth accurately in a difficult situation at personal cost, the revised record said. There is a difference between those two descriptions. It is the whole story. Subscribe to Regent Hearts. Share this today. Tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you. The servants' hall. The 4 drafts. The 17 items in 8 hours. Tuesday afternoons with Mrs. Pendleton. The North Field in February. The spring planning schedule on page 32. Or yes to everything, those were never actually separable. I read every single one. See you in the next story. Because there is always another one worth telling.